Next, we've got Deven McGraw.
So I wanted to give some thought to the idea of how do you create a privacy and security framework that works in the context of precision oncology and trying to learn more robustly from the data that is developed in the real-world setting, as well as clinical trials. And I went back to some papers that I wrote before I went into government, before I got the job I currently had, where I really looked at why we treat the reuse, and I don't like to call it secondary use, why we treat the reuse of data collected in a clinical context for learning purposes, where that learning is truly research intended to contribute to the generalized knowledge base. Why do we treat that differently? Why do we treat that as non-routine? Why isn't that just part and parcel of getting care? The expectation that not only are you going to get care, but there's going to be responsible reuse of your data for learning. And I don't know where, at what point we deviated from that, but nearly all of our legal structure around privacy assumes that research, even defined as contribution to generalizable knowledge and not just internal use to improve a product or a process or to figure out where the money is better spent, but really to contribute to generalized learning. I don't know where we deviated from that, but I think, so I'm proposing that we get there. Right? That we say this should be as routine a use as treatment, subject to some conditions, right? Because it's not like all research that's out there is trusted. And I think we can also use it as a leverage point to potentially solve some of the other issues that have been mentioned at the conference, including the serious ones that Bray just mentioned. Things like, contribute to, again, are you doing generalizable knowledge? Are you going to publish what you found, whether it's positive or negative? Are you committed to sharing, in fact, the data from what you're studying so that other people can study it too? Are you committed to inclusively studying all the patients in your setting or sharing data with institutions or enriching your data set with institutions who treat populations that you do not serve that might help to, again, enrich the data so that the data set actually looks like the world instead of just a segment of the world? Do you use data standards in producing and collecting your data? Do you follow data minimization techniques? So data minimization on the issue of identifiability, not on the issue of comprehensiveness of the data, not as a get out of jail free card from a regulatory perspective, but as a genuine effort to minimize the privacy risks of the data, but while still maintaining maximum utility in the data set. And then access controls. How are you brokering who can access your data, but in a responsible way, so that folks who are, again, contributing to generalizable knowledge can get access to that data, and that would include citizen scientists. Also, of course, making that data available to the individuals themselves in terms of not just return of results, but return of actual data that was collected. I think we can think about what would be our expectations for maybe considering this to be routine use, but requiring it to be subject to some ethical and normative standards. There actually is, despite the fact that I probably scared the crap out of some people yesterday with my presentation on regulatory developments in Europe and in California, I think there actually are some indications that there's receptivity to this. There is, for example, in the GDPR, allowance of processing of data for contributing to scientific research. But the problem is that the regulators haven't done a good enough job of explaining what that means. And so there's lots of confusion in the field about whether certain processing for research purposes can move forward absent the obtaining of consent, or do we have to make sure that we have consent from everyone in order to do this? CCPA, the California law, is another one where, the clinical trial enterprise got their exception, but the rest of research was totally left out. And so questions remain about that. Having said all of that, the idea that we would move forward without necessarily getting consent under any circumstance does still give a lot of people pause, even if we build in a lot of institutional controls. And so I think we need to look at what's going on in the All of Us program in terms of the really robust efforts to get truly informed but very broad consent from people to participate, and the evidence base that is developing on how well that is working in terms of people's perceptions of what's happening, as well as other efforts that are out there to try to see what can we do to not sort of leave people on the sidelines of this, but also, again, to have the research enterprise be the research use of data to be routine, because it needs to be routine.